Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Here's today's AppSec math problem. If you have X security tools and you shift Y of them left, how many secure designs do you have? Which means this week we chat with Allie Mellen about generative AI and just where exactly it's relevant to AppSec offense and defense. Check your math and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva, a Thales company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 292, recorded July 22nd, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Farshad Abbasi. Farshad, it's been a while.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, it's definitely been a while. It's great to be back on the show.
Great to have you filling in. John and Akira are just off this week, but they'll be back. They might also be back to join everyone who's invited to InfoSec World 2024 at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida, from September 23rd through 25th. Save 25% by using code ISW24-SW25 when you register at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld2024. Allie Mellen is a Forrester analyst covering security operations, nation-state threats, and the use of automation, machine learning, and AI in security tools. She has been in the technology industry for over a decade in various engineering roles, doing research at MIT, running her own engineering consultancy, and being a hacker before finally becoming a security practitioner. Hello, Allie. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And we're thrilled to find out all things about generative AI, maybe not all the things, but perhaps the things that are most relevant to AppSec offense and defense. But maybe before we get into both of those angles, because it's still quite broad, maybe tell us a little bit about when I say generative AI, let's set maybe a little bit of a definition or just figure out what are we actually talking about, or maybe by that means what we're not talking about as well.
Generative AI is really interesting because there's so much going on from a marketing perspective, how it's being talked about throughout every industry right now, that it can be very confusing what it is and what it isn't. So I'm really glad that we're starting the conversation here, because even when we do some surveys of security decision makers, AI decision makers, and one of the questions we asked AI decision makers was, do you think your executives understand what generative AI really is?
Uh-oh.
Long story short, they don't. So it is actually something that's really important for us to talk about and level set on before we get into this. I'm not saying that any of your listeners don't understand what it is, but just in case, it's important to go over it. When we think about generative AI, even if you say, put a request into Midjourney asking what it thinks it looks like, it has what looks pretty similar to a human being. Right? It thinks that it is this representation just based off of what it has learned from all of the information available on the internet of how humans perceive it. That's not the case, though. It's very much so different from that. What it ultimately is it's a way to probabilistically model what's going to happen next for a very complex sequence, and it does that extremely well, much better than anything that we've seen so far in traditional machine learning and AI. So that, just to be totally clear up front here, is a technical feat. Obviously, a very exciting technical feat. It isn't an artificial intelligence. It isn't something that's going to operate like a human brain, but it is an amazing step forward, and it can be applied really well to certain areas. Part of the reason I'm harping on this is because I am definitely a bit of an AI skeptic, or I prefer the term realist. But so I want to go into it with that point of view, because it also helps structure a lot of the conversation as to what we can actually use it for and what is just out of scope for the technical requirements and specifications that we have. Does that help?
That's a great framing, and I think you're in good company here in terms of the realism or skepticism. Then, because we do want to understand what one of the underlying themes I'm going to try to tease out here is what should we be really concerned about, and we'll start off with that maybe as your example. The genAI, that probabilistic language, like what word comes next, what token comes next. Mm-hmm. If we just start off with from the attacker's perspective, like does generative AI help attackers? And we talk about phishing emails could use generative AI, and maybe they'll have fewer typos. Maybe they'll sound slightly more natural, like an American English speaker rather than a British English speaker. I'm not going to do the accents, but the written word is what we care about.
Please do the accents. We can hear it.
It's going to come out sounding like Australian as I start to think of something. But let me turn the tables and ask you real quick while I come up with a good phrase to use here. If we do talk about phishing, like does generative AI make phishing worse? Things that we have to have new controls for, new worries about.
This is the really interesting thing, especially when we think about it from the attacker perspective, is that on the one hand, sure, it can be useful for generative AI, basically to use it to automate some phishing email creation. But the example that I've seen come up quite often is, now these emails won't have as many spelling mistakes. In some cases, phishing emails are intentionally designed with spelling mistakes, with grammar mistakes, because they want to target a particular audience. It's just like any other type of marketing where it's trying to get you to click if you're a specific user. And so I like to take a step back from this because attackers are much more considerate of these little details in some cases than we give them credit for. And so it's not necessarily going to dramatically change how we see phishing emails come in and what they're going to look like. Now, the exception to this, I do think, is that it will help with some of the translation aspects between different languages. So if you're looking to have a phishing email in a specific language, this could make it a little bit easier in conjunction with typical translation tools. And it could also automate some of these aspects a little bit more effectively. But whether or not this is going to cause like a massive addition of phishing emails, we haven't seen that so far, at least not in practice. And that's one of the things that I see more and more is a lot of the ways that quote unquote attackers are using generative AI is really just people in academia, people who are doing research, people who are making proof of concepts for how you could use this. But the attackers aren't necessarily doing it in most cases because at the end of the day, it's a lot more work for them to focus on development using generative AI than it is to just use the tried and true methods that they have been using for so long.
Yeah, and I think one of the other reasons I was asking that question too is, does it introduce more new controls that we need to worry about? Meaning, if these are phishing emails that are trying to basically get your username and password, if we have passkeys, that's pretty phishing resistant. So it doesn't matter if they're scaling, they're going to fill up our inboxes, they're going to be annoying. But hopefully that control of something like a passkey is really what defeats most of those, credential, username, password types of attacks.
100%. Totally. And that's the thing too, is the vehicle to create new phishing emails, the vehicle to create some different types of malware, it changes, but the outcome doesn't. And the way that we defend doesn't. So I love this point because it's very important to think about where we're going to put our energy. And in reality, all we need to do is keep putting our energy towards making sure our organization is protected overall, not specifying down into generative AI. The other thing too is if attackers do start using generative AI more broadly for phishing emails, it's going to be really consistent. It's going to be really easy to identify. It's like when you go to ChatGPT right now and you copy paste an answer into a report. people read that report and they're like, this doesn't sound like a human actually wrote it.
Yes.
Like, we're going to figure out those patterns with our security technology as well to be able to find those types of instances where it's clearly not something that's been made by a human.
So maybe, and I like how you said that phrase, where do we put our energy? Because one of the promises of generative AI was to save us time, save us energy, save us effort on writing code, for example. And you had an example that we had talked before about, chatbots. Ask a chatbot, is this vuln present in my environment? I mean, as a promise, if I can ask a chatbot to tell me that I have the latest regression, OpenSSH, what have you, and it gives me an answer, I mean, on paper, that sounds amazing, but maybe it doesn't quite work that way. Is it as magical as I hope it is?
Sadly, no.
Okay.
Sorry to crush all the dreams here. There's a couple of things. First off, just from a user experience standpoint, I have a lot of challenges with chatbots to begin with, because if you think about it, one of my coworkers, Julie Osk, she had this expression. She covers B2B marketing, but she has this really interesting expression that honestly is universal, which is customers want convenience, not conversations. A chatbot isn't the answer to everything. We don't always want to talk to a human. That's part of the reason why we have things like Uber Eats and Amazon, right? And so relying on a chatbot and on querying that chatbot whenever you want is not nearly as beneficial as building into the workflow exactly what you want to happen and making sure that the analyst, the user, has the information they need at exactly the right time. So they don't have to have yet another tab open. So that's on the chatbot side of things. But more importantly, when it comes to conversations around identifying vulnerabilities, as one example, or really understanding anything about the enterprise environment, there are two issues at play here, right? If we think about two of the most unsolved problems across security right now, they come down to, first off, we have not been able to successfully get all of the business data and business context that we need to understand vulnerabilities, to understand detection of attacker activity. We have not been able to get all that data in one place. We could technically do it, but it would be way too expensive for the business. It would also be very difficult to manage with a number of different people managing them. The closest thing we have is using the SIM as an example, but even in those cases, you have to move some of that data to long-term storage. You have to have a bunch of different strategies in mind. We don't have to get into all the technical specifics here. But that problem isn't solved by generative AI. So if we can't get all the data in one place, then we can't have generative AI analyzing all of the data, which it needs to do in one place, in order to give you the appropriate output to make sure it knows exactly what's going on in the environment. Now, you might say, Allie, no big deal. We don't have to have all the data in one place. We can use generative AI as basically the translate mechanism between the human and the business environment. And it can just use a bunch of APIs and integrations to say, hey, is this vulnerability here? Is this vulnerability there? Or whatever the query is, just translate that and handle it on the back end, which sounds great until you realize that the second biggest problem in security is the fact that security tools don't work together. We have a huge problem with the fact that security tools are very difficult to make work together and are constantly changing. I mean, we have entire teams dedicated to trying to solve this problem, and it's still really difficult. And until we solve that problem, which generative AI, again, at least so far, hasn't solved, then we're not going to be able to use it reliably to understand everything about the enterprise environment and be able to give you back good information. Don't get me wrong, it can give you back some information. But if it tells you you don't have a vulnerability present in your environment, and that's just because it only sees a third of your estate, that's a big problem.
Yeah, and that's a great point in that idea that generative AI, it's, I'm trying to summarize what you just said very, very well. I don't know if I need to, other than just, did you have that visibility in the first place? It's not introducing new capabilities, right?
Yes.
But by that same token, then, are there areas where it doesn't need all of the knowledge, all of that visibility to be useful? And here, like, I'm thinking of like writing up a report, or helping something like new users, someone new to the team? Where have you seen it be successful in these smaller contexts?
Yes, 100%. So at Forrester, we wrote a report around generative AI when it first came out, and we write a bunch of different reports on this because it's such a popular topic. And the way that we bucket generative AI use cases in security is into one of three areas. There's content creation, so things like code generation, image generation, all of that. There's knowledge articulation, so that's the chatbot use case. And then there's behavior prediction, which is a very interesting one that we don't see used as frequently yet, but I do think that's going to change over time. Behavior prediction is, if you think about it, since generative AI is able to probabilistically model that next token that is most likely, it could do that for any type of behavior. In the case of ChatGPT and others, we see that being done for language, but you can make a lot of different things into a language. You can make user behavior into a language. You can make attacker behavior into a language. And so you could feasibly apply it there. It has some limitations, which is why it's not being used there in the mainstream. Namely, there are other methods using just machine learning that are more effective and especially more cost effective. And until that changes, you're not going to see it used for that use case. But there's potential. That's really interesting. And I would be remiss, given our conversation just now, not to highlight that one of the really interesting applications that we're seeing a lot of companies experiment with is, can we use generative AI basically as a translator between APIs? We're seeing this across industries. Okay. So potentially, generative AI could eventually solve that problem and make it so that we could actually have that overall universal understanding of the enterprise, but we're not there yet. And there are a lot of gates that are going to keep that from being a reality in the short term. Mainly, like if you're creating API integrations on the fly, then you still need to test them. You still need to make sure that they're secure. There still needs to be some human QA in there. And that is a big barrier to making this work more dynamically. But the biggest benefits that we've seen, coming back to your original question, now that I've taken us down this rabbit hole, is on the content creation side, particularly around reporting. Just as you mentioned, I love reporting as a use case because, I don't love writing reports, to be honest, even though I do a lot of that for my job. I don't think most security professionals love writing reports. So that's an incredibly useful use case. And then script analysis as well, and understanding what some scripts are doing, so that you don't have to spend all the manual effort to make that happen.
It's funny that you mentioned that about using AI to understand APIs and do that. I just did that a couple of weekends ago. We had a fairly large client. They gave me a ton of information about their APIs, and I needed to understand it all. Sat down with a tool. It's called Cursor. It's an IDE. It's got AI built in. It's really cool. Highly recommend it. It's open source. I sat there in front of it. Within a few hours, I'd written a bunch of Python scripts that processed all the APIs, gave me all the information that I needed very quickly. This would have been really, really time consuming in the past. I did want to bring up, go back to the phishing discussion that we were having earlier. You were mentioning so that, if the AI generated it, it might be too perfect. And, people might be suspicious that, hey, it doesn't have all the spelling mistakes. But couldn't we give some examples? Like, here's like 100 different phishing emails, write them like this. And AI would build it exactly like that with the spelling mistakes and all that same style.
We absolutely could. But my question is, why would we do that? We already have 100 examples we can use.
Yes. and that's a great point, because you kind of alluded to in that conversation, like, phishing, the attackers actually do have their own software stacks. They have probably their own Jira ticketing queues, their own development lifecycle. And they have cost. And a lot of what we talk about is in InfoSec is metaphorical cost, time, effort from the attacker. But there's money out there too. And Allie, you mentioned as well, the cost of AI. Maybe, we have, I'll say old school ML by this day, because we've had a form of AI and cascading if statements for a few decades now. But like I've talked to a few vendors in this space, but I don't know that I'll get the same answer out of the vendor for a question of, how do we frame this conversation around the cost of using AI? Meaning, it's really cool. It's fun to have a chatbot, play with it. But, every question I ask, that's probably maybe more than a few cents, maybe actually more than a few dollars or tens of dollars for it to generate that fun response, right?
This is such a complex question right now because we see some early implementations that are either incorporating the cost. Like if you look at it from one of the vendors in my coverage area, the XDR vendors, it's like an add-on for an per endpoint cost, or it's like just a overall add-on for the year based around the number of users. But these are in no way what the final pricing is going to be for using generative AI. And it's particularly complicated, coming back to what I said before. If you do implement a chatbot use case, that's pretty easy to at least understand usage because you can see how many times are they prompting the system. If you integrate it into the user experience, which will be much more effective for the user, it is much more difficult for them to control the usage. And you can kind of understand it the same, but from their standpoint, they're not making the choice to execute that prompt. It's being executed for them, and they're seeing a price increase because of it. So the TLDR on this is it is in no way done. We're in no way finished with this conversation about pricing and how to price this. And there's a lot of strategies happening at a lot of these companies to look for means to implement it into the system, but also to reduce costs, either by like not using as much generative AI or making sure that the models are very specifically trained, things like that, reducing the number of prompts that you actually have to use. It depends a lot, but there's a lot of work being done in that area for sure to make sure the price stays down.
And part of what Farshad was describing is that, generative AI was just helping him understand the plumbing. How do I use this API, which is a time saver there, especially for smaller Appsec teams or just even small engineering teams, which are probably also sensitive to costs, which is why I want to bring this in. So, if we go back to the initial premise of, largely stated, what can generative AI do for defense, do for Appsec? If it's a small Appsec team or a small engineering team, a startup considering this, what does anything change for them? What guidance would you have on, bring in all the chatbots, all the AIs, all your tools can be automated? I'm being slightly facetious, but hopefully there's something useful there, or how do you have that conversation with them?
Yeah, it's complicated. There's a couple of factors that I recommend weighing as you think about this. First off, what is the value add that you're looking to get out of it? Is obviously the most important one. So are you looking to use this for something like automated patching, or at least to a certain extent, how do we automatically generate patches that we can then apply, which is something that's very popular in AppSec right now for how generative AI is starting to be used. Of course, you got to keep in mind that's for very specific use cases. That's another part of this is the demos. The demos make it seem like this is going to be able to work for a lot more things than it actually does. So take that with a grain of salt. And then one other thing that's important, especially for smaller teams, but for large teams as well, is who's actually going to be using this and why are you letting them use this? One of the biggest problems that I see is that a lot of the messages in the market right now are focused around, hey, this will upskill your less experienced practitioners, right? I think that's actually incredibly risky for the business to take on because we still have the problem of you don't know if it's giving you accurate recommendations. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a company who, I obviously can't get specific here, but sells a generative AI product for security operations. And one of the things that it does is it recommends a next step to take, a next response action to take. Now, at first you think, wow, that's really cool. An analyst could come in here and just say, yeah, I'm just going to execute this action, or now I know what to do next. This is teaching me. Problem was, the recommended response action was to block Excel across the enterprise. I mean...
yeah, good luck being a human consultant trying to deliver that in your report, right?
That's the thing. And that was admittedly a real example, but a ridiculous example. To take it down a level, imagine if it was just saying block macros across the environment. Still terrible. But maybe something that somebody who's brand new, just out of school, has learned their best practices that are don't enable macros, is willing to implement. So why are we giving advice to people that we don't know is accurate for the enterprise, for the situation, especially when they're newer personnel? And so the way that I think about this is a really useful feature for people who have a lot of experience, who know exactly what needs to be done, and they just want something where they can look, validate, and execute it quickly. And for everyone else, we should be very discerning and careful about how much we recommend following these steps.
Yeah, and I think there's an aspect there too of, when we talked at the very beginning about, is this vuln present in my environment? You pointed out, you need a lot of data to figure out that in the first part. But even here, as in that example you're describing, block Excel across the environment. Okay, what is the business context? What's what was the operational context of that? And I don't know exactly how you would train a model to do that. That does feel like we do need that human intuition, or even because there's probably not going to be a specific answer every single time, we need that human negotiation to figure out what are the trade-offs, what are the iterative ways we can, have a control that's going to be effective here.
1,000%. It's so true. Like, the business context becomes very, very important. Some of that we can bring in. It does come back to the integrations conversation and the fact that we can't really integrate those tools very effectively with security tools alone, let alone the business tools. But then again, a part of it too is just tribal knowledge. And you're not going to have something necessarily defined somewhere that says, don't block Excel across the environment. People just know this. They just don't do this once they've had enough experience in the industry. So,
yeah, I think, Allie, the point you made about having that context across the business is really important. I talk about this with colleagues all the time. You've got platforms that are ASPM, you got CSPM, you got SIM, you got all this stuff. But if you look at the attacker is not just going to attack your application. So if you don't have the full context, they're going to attack something, pivot from there to something else. It might go across several applications, infrastructure, desktops, other things. So you really need that full picture. If the developers, I say, I've got like 1,000 vulnerabilities to fix, ASPM is telling me to fix these things. If you had better context, you could better prioritize in the fix that actually could enable them to attack across the enterprise. Right now, within the application, we're just focusing on the application vulnerabilities. We fix what we can. The ASPM prioritizes those, but it doesn't have the broader context. So we might be fixing something that doesn't really matter in that broader context. Yeah. So I think that's something that's really important for these tools to integrate and give the company that view that includes everything, all their vulnerabilities. Then they can prioritize appropriately. That's one of the biggest challenges that I see at the moment.
I totally agree. I mean, that's the context that makes such a big difference is, okay, you got these vulnerabilities, but do you have compensating controls to deal with them? Or are they just way more important because you don't, or you can't establish those? Like,
exactly.
100%.
Yes, and we as CrowdStrike demonstrated, we have the compensating controls of blocking windows across the environment, which is kind of the worst case possibility here. But that's don't want to beat up on them too much. It's just a little bit topical. But
yeah, rough weekend.
Allie, rough weekend. Hugs to everyone trying to deal with that. But trying to come back to something perhaps looking to the future. You mentioned too, a lot of the attackers, I am kind of curious, can generative AI, or maybe you can expand it to AI, introduce new concerns? Are attackers going to have something new and different? And you had mentioned that they do seem to be, largely theoretical. These tend to be like PhD candidates who are showing, oh, here's what could happen. Here's some fun stuff we're playing with. And honestly, there is an appeal to me of the fun things that are divorced from Skynet, Blade Runner, the movie silliness. This is like, okay, this is actually possibly how you're going to use it. What do you have something fun there? Do you have something that you see might be emerging, or what are you watching in that space from these types of attacks or research?
I think super useful for recon. I mean, so much, especially if the generative AI has context on what you're talking about. Easier to just ask those questions there. There's also just a lot of interest around how to potentially attack these models, which I think is very interesting, but very challenging. And it doesn't necessarily give you an output as an attacker that is worth, like, the juice isn't worth the squeeze kind of deal in that situation, at least for now. I do think that for all my skepticism, the one exception to this is going to be nation state attackers. They're definitely looking for more complex ways and doing additional research to make sure that they can leverage generative AI either from their perspective from attacking or in order to access systems that are leveraging generative AI for things like disinformation, as an example.
Sure.
But more complex use cases as well in the long term. That's just more short term, especially given how many elections are happening right now. And then the other thing is, I do think that the deepfake use case is really interesting and very difficult to defend against. A lot of that, I say that with the caveat that at least when it comes to business circumstances, same controls, same governance controls. Like if you get a deepfake call from that you don't know is a deepfake from the CEO, quote unquote, and he says to wire $50 million to this account, you should probably check with someone else first. Like that's just governance control that you need to have in place. And if you don't, then there's a deeper problem, and this could have happened regardless of whether you're using a deepfake. But I do think that it's interesting, especially like given that my coverage kind of crosses over between what the attackers are doing, what nation states are doing, and AI. The deepfake conversation is just getting so much more complex every single day and so much more interesting every single day.
And to riff on that a little bit, part of the reason that appeals to me is that despite this being Application Security Weekly, I struggle to find what is the AppSec control around deepfakes. We're starting to get into, call it trust and safety for, abuse, bullying. Being a woman on the internet, you probably understand a lot of how deepfakes and just AIs can be used and platforms can be used for abuse. And those aren't like, there's no top 10 list. Don't write more secure code for this. It's more of how is this product, how can it be abused or how can it be used to protect users? And that seems, we're still figuring those out. And AI maybe is making it worse, but maybe not even helping either. Maybe it does help with moderation. Not sure.
This is such an excellent point because that's the biggest challenge here is just deepfake detection, dynamic detection of deepfakes in real time. Like all of that is so much more complicated than some of the traditional security problems that we faced and blends into that trust and safety team. And especially with the virality of things, just becomes so much more complicated. So the fact that we're making that even easier every day with generative AI, I mean, it's a big problem and requires, it's not just a AppSec problem or trust and safety problem, obviously. It's also like it is going to come back to the critical thinking that we have, the trusted sources that we have from a societal standpoint.
And one of the things I wanted to wrap up here in the show notes, we'll have a couple of your blog posts that have been helpful. I think we covered a couple like the things to consider to know about how generative AI is used in security tools. And this is where you're talking about the content creation, behavior prediction, pointing out that GenAI probably won't replace your team. But you have another one about the blob, and maybe let's end on some fun, reference. What the heck is a blob, and why are we worried?
Yay! I'm so glad you brought the blob up. Okay, so the blob. This is probably not the reference that you're thinking of, so just bear with me. But Ben Rhodes was the Deputy National Security Advisor for the Obama administration. And at the time, he coined the term the blob to describe the foreign policy establishment in Washington, particularly because there was a group of people who were just deeply immersed in their own groupthink around the Iraq War and all of that. And I think we have a blob of our own insecurity, and it's definitely come out of the woodwork this past weekend with the CrowdStrike outage. It comes up with generative AI a lot, but it's a group of people who tend to be very just immersed in a lot of the marketing messages in the industry and not necessarily understanding that layer deeper of how things are actually working from a technical perspective and taking that into consideration when outlandish things are being said. So things like, we're going to have the autonomous SOC, we're going to replace all of our people with generative AI. Once you dig down into the technical specifics, regardless of your background, it becomes very clear that that's not going to be the reality that we have. But there's so many messages perpetuating these types of things that it can be difficult to sift through. And I find a lot of times it leaves even me second guessing myself and trying to say, okay, am I missing something here that everyone else is seeing? What's happening? And so I love to highlight this idea of us having a blob of our own in security, because I think we really need, coming back to that conversation we had earlier on prioritizing and trying to figure out what to put your energy towards. We should be putting our energy towards the actual applications of these technologies, the actual challenges that we're facing, instead of talking theoretically, because that's when we're going to start really being able to have a major impact and really support the industry better in the future.
Yeah, and that's a great, realistic, good, sobering, I think you're asking us to, within the industry to actually have a nuanced conversation rather than just be some sound bites. So thank you for that, Allie. You've been a wonderful help. I'm going to continue to hallucinate that the blob is referencing the Steve McQueen movie as a sci-fi fan, but
I'm so sorry to let you down.
That's okay. But you haven't let us down for sure on this conversation. So you've taken us on a great journey about just what generative AI is and what it can or can't do, or how to anticipate using it. So I want to say just thank you again for sharing this insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Thanks again to Allie. Thanks for Shad as well. And thanks for everyone who's been listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.